one sign of that's encouraging are the number of people who are alarmed about the size of government. And I compare it to my youth, say the 60s and 70s, when I felt much more lonely and was surrounded by much stranger people who agreed with me. And now I feel a much larger and more normal group of people shares my views. And yet government just keeps getting bigger. So maybe it's not enough.
Well, culture comes before politics, and politics come before law. So I think that, the culture has to change first. I think to some degree it has. I think I think libertarianism doesn't look nearly as weird as it used to. I think you see shifts on a number of attitudes. And if you actually look at the popular discussion, I mean, there's a fairly dumb article in Salon that says, we can have gun prohibition because, look, we have gay marriage. But if you look at the things that have changed in American society, generally, in terms of social movements, the ones that succeed are in favor of more individual liberty, not less.
Well, that's true.
I mean, the gay marriage movement basically has worked not because Americans have any huge excitement about gay marriage per se, because the majority of heterosexual Americans don't really care much, but they have a general bias in favor of letting people do what they want.
That's true.
In fact, I think that's driven the failure of the gun control movement too. So I think there's a lot to be said for that, and I think that's a hopeful sign. I don't think that that's a reason to relax and be certain that nothing bad can happen in this best of all possible worlds. But at the same time, I do think that there's a strong tendency for libertarians to get kind of gloomy and to think that nothing can happen. And if you actually look at the daily lives of average people in the United States over the last several decades, in many ways, they've gotten much freer. So,
I totally agree. The only difference is that small area called your pocketbook. But other than that, which I don't want to understate how important that other aspect of our lives are, the other kind of freedoms. But I think the economic freedom part is the thing that is most at risk, and it does underpin civilization in a certain extent. So I'm a little worried about it.
Well, no, you're right. But I think actually that's one of the things, I think Milton Friedman once said, the reason you'd never get to a fully libertarian society was that if you got halfway there, everybody would be so rich and happy they'd quit trying. And sort of the optimistic view is to say that's kind of what happened.
Yeah,
that actually we lightened up in the 80s with a lot of deregulation and such, and a lot of, and people got a lot richer and happier. And so they kind of got complacent and quit trying. And it may be that one of the things we need is to go through this Obama economic stagnation and malaise, and for people to realize that this stuff actually makes a difference, that you can't just sort of take it for granted that a big wave of prosperity and freedom is going to always be cresting under you without any effort on your part. And I think the key to having that happen is actually for us to make sure that people realize that, why they're stagnating, why something that can't go on forever won't, and what can't go on forever, and why it can't. And I think that's a message to get out. That's actually sort of been my long-term strategy with this series of these columns in USA Today, is to try to get this kind of stuff out to people who are, outside the usual libertarian fold.
Yeah, I like your argument about complacency, although I do think some of the deregulation of the 80s is greatly overstated. It's nice in the late 70s. It's nice to get rid of some of the regulations of transportation and air travel and trucking and those things. They were replaced by different kinds of regulations that limited freedom elsewhere. But there have been some moments of actual freedom.
The biggest breakthrough was the internet, which simply grew faster than the regulators could keep up. And unfortunately, that's coming to an end. I mean, the internet is still the most free place in terms of activity in the economy, and it'll probably stay that for a while. But the regulators, the special interests, and all the others are definitely trying to carve things up and get a bigger piece of the pie and more control. And you can't rely on that forever. I think the internet made a lot of people over the last 20 years complacent as well.
Well, talk about what you're worried about coming there, because it seems to me there is a tremendous cultural force to leaving the internet alone. I understand that what we observe in our day-to-day lives isn't actually what the regulatory environment is actually about. But, for example, the attempts to tax the internet haven't been very successful. What regulations are you worried about for the internet?
Well, because there's already some pretty draconian regulation on the internet, stemming from the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and things like that. Intellectual property stuff. Now, it tends to be kind of under-enforced, which I think is great, but it does give them an opportunity to go after people when somebody's targeted. I think we're going to see more of that. I mean, we've had the SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act effort last year, which failed, and apparently was a sufficiently painful experience for members of Congress that they're a bit gun-shy now, but that won't last forever. And the way these things work is they keep trying until they get what they want, typically, or until they're beaten down so badly that they don't try for a while.
Well, yeah, it's the Willie Sutton theory of regulation, right?
Right.
Willie Sutton asked why rob banks. That's where the money is. It's hard for politicians to ignore the internet. It's where the action is, the money, the activity. So it is a constant temptation.
I mean, I think that's right, and I think the optimistic look at the SOPA battle was, they came at us in the same old way, and we beat them in the same old way. But the pessimistic look is to say, and they'll be back again.
It's true.
So I think it's a constant back and forth on that front.
Yeah, vigilance. Let's turn to your book, An Army of Davids, which was written 7 years ago, or came out 7 years ago, where you noted the phenomenon of the decentralization of power away from traditional centralized nodes of power, such as media being an obvious example, and your success with Instapundit, which has been extraordinary. It's an incredible blog. What did you say in the book at the time about that decentralization? What do you think has happened in the meanwhile that's either reinforced or changed your mind?
Well, the basic thesis of the book was that technology was changing a lot of things. We went through sort of the industrial era with its emphasis on economies of scope and scale, where to do a lot of things worthwhile in an efficient way, you had to be big. When a steam engine had to be big enough to power a factory, pretty much all you were going to do with steam engines was power factories. And a lot of stuff worked that way, and, we got to the point where bigger was better. And I was watching, not that long ago, an old movie from the 30s. It was H.G. Wells' Things to Come. And when you see the future in I think it's supposed to be the 22nd century or something, in that, what are there but a bunch of huge locomotive-sized machines chewing up mountains? Because to somebody in 1930, that was the future, right?
Yeah, that would be a big deal.
Thing. Right. And it reminds me of the old, I quote this in the book, to sort of when the tide started to change was the joke from the old Soviet Union, right? Introducing the Soviet microchip, the world's largest. Because, the Soviets were always bragging about having the world's biggest this and the world's biggest that, the biggest dam, the biggest airplane. There's also, that was they were an industrial age economy taken to the point of absurdity. Well, now that's not the way things go. And, just for example, with this podcast, and things like that, with a laptop computer and an iPhone, you've got capabilities that TV networks didn't have a couple of decades ago. And as a result, you see all kinds of journalism and opinion and other stuff being done that never would have made it in the old days. You see that in all kinds of sort of micro manufacturing and sales. I mean, I know people, they all seem to be women, who make money selling handcrafts on Etsy and make a living that way. And people who sell stuff on eBay individually. If you're an eBay power seller, you can get health insurance. There are all kinds of ways you can make a living now and do stuff as an individual or a small group that used to require a big organization. And so that's the basic theme of Army of Davids. And I sort of walk through that in a variety of areas: media, music, manufacturing, different stuff. How do I feel that? I mean, I think that holds true to a great degree. And one thing I will say that's sort of a cheerful sign is you don't even need a free country for that to work. For example, in China, one of the interesting things that's happened is, the army used to drive all over people's property and not worry about it. And then everybody got cell phones, and they started complaining. And weirdly, even in what's fundamentally a military dictatorship. When a lot of people complain, they start to notice, and they change their ways.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing. What do you think, how would you sum up the impact, though, of technology? We're talking about this podcast or other media changes. Certainly the blogosphere has given a lot of entertainment to a lot of people. What do you think its impact has been on media, actually? And how important is it?
How important is it? Well, I mean, if you look at the fact that traditional media organizations are going broke, I mean, Newsweek doesn't have a print edition and barely even exists anymore. I think there's real impact, and I know, in terms of my own media habits and those of a lot of people I know, I spend a lot of time on things that are not big media productions. And my brother teaches history at Northern Kentucky University, and one interesting thing he's done several times is he's asked his class of undergraduates to name their favorite bands. And what he finds is that not only do basically all of them have different favorite bands, most of them haven't even heard of each other's favorite bands. It's not like in the 60s or 70s where, half the class would say Beatles and half the class would say Stones, or something like that. Now the culture is sufficiently diverse that there's sort of nobody that really markets the whole thing.
I love that. I think that's just a beautiful thing. But a lot of people, I'm not one of them, but a lot of people are alarmed by the death of traditional media. Thinks, we're listening to too many echo chambers. It's not healthy. It's not good for democracy. Do you agree or disagree?
I think that their complaint is that we have more than one echo chamber, and it's not the one they control. I think that traditional media, you talk about how in the 60s or 70s, if you were a libertarian, you felt like a weirdo. Well, that was because libertarianism didn't really get any attention in the traditional media.
Glenn, I didn't say I felt like a weirdo. I said I felt lonely. And the people who were around me were mostly weirdos.
Sorry, that's right.
It could have included me. I'm not I'm not ruling that out. But I just want to get the facts straight.
Well, I really think that that argument is fairly weak. The argument that we're all going to be a bunch of echo chambers talking to each other. I mean, that's essentially Cass Sunstein's original argument in Republic.com, and even in the second edition of that, he kind of backed away from it. But the other side of it is that I think that if people really believe that, if I, for example, ran the New York Times and I believed that was so bad, then it would I think behoove me to make my newspaper a lot more inclusive than the New York Times is, or most of the other places that you hear about this.
Well, they have struggled to stay competitive for a variety of reasons, one of which is their unwillingness, I think, or inability to respond to the change. A lot of cultural reasons for that, and blindness, myopia is part of it. But it's been interesting. It's interesting to watch. What do you think is coming to the blogosphere? More of the same or anything different? Any trends you see that are worth noting?
It seems to me that the blogosphere is in a fairly stable state right now. You still have, which I think is interesting, people who appear and sort of become stars pretty rapidly. So I think it's still quite open to new entrants. I don't think it's locked in. But the sort of style and format of blogging have now been stable for a number of years. Twitter was going to be the next big thing, and my sense is it's never quite been the next big thing. Journalists love Twitter, because Twitter is great when you're standing in line waiting to get into a congressional hearing and you've got your smartphone out. You can click through it and snipe at each other and that sort of thing. On the other hand, I find it sort of unsatisfying, and I actually find it kind of, the bad thing about Twitter is it's emotionally agitating if you pay a lot of attention to it. I find it harder to.
Why is that, you think? I've heard that claim, and I feel a little bit of it myself in my tweet activity. Why is that?
I think a lot of it's the format. You get exposed to a lot of different stuff. The 140 character limit, I think, encourages people to be more provocative. There's something about Twitter that encourages a lot more sort of just back and forth flat fights. And I think, that's a lot of it. But I don't know. I just don't like it. I mean, Facebook, as a social media forum is sort of more social and less media. I think Twitter, on the other hand, doesn't have much of a social aspect really, and I think that it just seems to be harsher. It's more like people sort of driving by and yelling something out the window at each other.
Yeah, I feel that sometimes. I think we need to increase the characters to 150. We need a government regulation to increase the minimum and we'd be fine. Civility would reign. Maybe it's 160. We'll fill it out.